Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great webinar from cpaacademy.org. My name is Vaughn Smith. I will be your moderator for today's session. We are so glad you have taken time out of your busy day to spend the next hour with us. We have some great information from some presenters that are right up here on with me on our webcams. I'd like to make sure that everything is working a-okay, that you can hear my voice. You can see that title slide. You can see us on the webcams. You can jump over to that Q&A section over in your interface. Type us a message, say hello, tell us where you're tuning in from. We always love to see that. And the place that you are typing into right now is a place you can let me know if you are having any technical difficulties during this session. There's a bunch of you in here today, so it might take me just a moment to get around to you, but please let me know if you're having any problems with either the polls or the reception. Rule of thumb, refresh your browser. That usually goes ahead and resets everything and gets your connection back on track. But of course, please go ahead and let me know. Whew, that thing is flying by. Let's go ahead and see. I'm going to try to find some. We've got a Massachusetts, Ocala. I'm not far from you. We've also got Indiana, and it looks like we've got Texas and Tucson, Arizona. It's going really fast. All right, wonderful. Thank you all so much for letting me know that things are A-okay. This session does qualify for 1 CPE credit. You need to remain logged in for at least 15 minutes. Answer our polls. We have 4 polls for you today. You only need 3 for credit, but we know it's just so much fun to answer those polls. So make sure you go ahead and answer them all. Select your answer and hit the submit so it registers for your credit. Once we're done, we'll go ahead and tally all of that and put that into our reports and get that into your CPA Academy accounts in about 24 to 48 hours for your credit. You'll also find your resources in there, such as your handouts, a recording of the session, and an evaluation. We always want to hear from you, so make sure you fill that out after we are done. Okay, I think I've covered everything I need to on my end for our housekeeping. I'm going to turn things over to our friends at Layton. So we're going to go ahead and bring up Megan and Mark. It's all yours. Take it away.
I'm going to actually kick it off. So happy to be here. Happy Friday Eve, everyone. For those who are new here, Layton is a global consultancy specializing in tax strategies and incentives. So today we are here to talk about our core competencies, one of which being 179D 45L, highlighting apprenticeship and prevailing wages. So to introduce myself, I am Strategic Development Manager here at Layton, where I help lead our partnership division. So I partner with CPAs all across the country, acting as an extension of themselves for services specific, like we're discussing today. PSA to all of you who are going to be in attendance to the AICPA SEMA Engage event in Vegas this year in June. My team and I will be there located at booth 803. So please come by and say hello. I'd love to meet in person while you're there. As far as the CR industry goes, I have been very integrated in this area for the last several months, partnering with CPAs, developers, architects. So there's a lot of gray in this area, especially when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act and understanding all of its nuances. So really happy to be here today to clear up the air, add some perspective and insight with our incredible practice lead, Mark Bacon. Mark has been, all over the country doing all sorts of properties from jails to high-tech commercial buildings to incredibly secure pilot drone testing facilities. So very well experienced, but Mark, I'll pass it over to yourself to further introduce you.
All right, thank you, Taylor. Appreciate everyone taking the time. I know CPE credits are always interesting. I used to work for CPA firms, so I will do my best to try to make this interesting for everybody. So my name is Mark Bacon. I'm a licensed professional engineer. Been doing these energy efficiency studies for quite a while. Between me and the team, we've done about 10,000 of these studies. So like Taylor mentioned, there's probably not a lot of buildings that I haven't been inside, and not a lot of steam tunnels I haven't been crawling through trying to figure out some energy efficiency deductions and credits for our clients. So it's definitely an interesting space. I find one of the biggest challenges with 179D and 45L in particular, and we'll talk about cost seg a little bit later, is like many things in the tax code, it is not strongly advertised. So a lot of this comes down to education and information more than anything. So hopefully you'll learn a little bit today and see if this is applicable for any of your clients, or if you're a business owner, applicable for you as well. So I think with that, we'll start going through. So what are we going to go through today? Just to give everyone kind of a high level, we'll pick up some polling questions here right after we go through the first slide here. But basically the question comes in, when do you do these incentives? And then how do you, what are the overviews? How do you qualify for these particular incentives? We'll go through them in more detail. Like Taylor mentioned, a couple big ticket items is what changed through the Inflation Reduction Act. I think a lot of you are well aware, massive changes through the Inflation Reduction Act for a lot of different things. Today we'll talk specifically about how it changed 179D and 45L, but it also affected a lot of other things as well. So some of the information we'll present today applies for other incentives as well. Namely, kind of the quote-unquote elephant in the room, prevailing wage and apprenticeship. If you dug into this very much, you will find that is a very big deal. So we'll talk through that a little bit. And then we can talk through some real-world examples. What is this worth to your clients or to your business, and why you should pursue this? So I think with that, Vaughn, can you launch our first polling question just to get everyone started?
No problem. Let me go ahead and do that. I have poll number 1 on your screen, so go ahead and get your votes in. Keep our polls open for about 60 seconds to allow you to get your votes in. So go for it now. Thank you so much.
Great. Yes. Why are you here today? We would love to know. A, I want to learn more about energy efficiency. B, I'm pretty familiar, but I want a better understanding of energy efficiency. And C, here for CPE credit. Wonderful. We have a lot want to learn more about energy efficiency. So happy to be here. Mark, we have some interesting people.
The first 5 of you answered real quick that you're here for CPE credit. I appreciate the honesty. All right. Well, yeah, we'll just leave this open for a little bit just to see. It gives us an idea of how to tailor between option A and B. It kind of lets us know the level of expertise, so to speak, in the room. So I'm not telling you things you don't already know, hopefully.
All right, yeah, and feel free to move ahead, and you can look at those results as they come through. We'll just keep it open for a little bit longer to let everybody get their votes in for CPE. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so let's talk through energy efficiency incentives. So what are they? Pretty high level, as you probably expect, and I probably don't need to explain this to anybody, but one of the most powerful mechanisms the government has to incentivize behavior is actually tax deductions and credits. So why do we need that? It's because a very large portion of energy use, some people say up to 40% of all energy use in the US actually comes from buildings. You layer in, some of the peripheral costs of that, and even like the carbon footprint alone of buildings is extremely high. Some say 50% of carbon emissions come from actual buildings, depending on how far you follow the value chain there. But anything that we can do to incentivize making that easier or making it quicker or more efficient is extremely useful to the country. So a BTU saved is a BTU we don't have to burn. So if you get more insulation, use less energy. The couple methods of doing that, there's a carrot and a stick method. So 179D and 45L are a carrot. They will give you a tax deduction or a tax credit if you make a building more efficient. Those of you who are in New York City will be aware of Local Law 97. That is a stick. It is a penalty if you do not meet certain emission standards. So there's a couple ways the government can do it. I like to think of 179D and 45L as the thing you probably should be doing before the penalties start coming in. There are a lot of states and municipalities that are starting to push a lot of these incentives and saying, okay, you have to reduce your carbon footprint. You have to stop using boilers by the state, like gas boilers. There's a bunch of different places that have started to do that. This is the opportunity for you and your clients to get ahead of it before those penalties start coming into play. So we're talking about tax deductions and credits, but of course there are also grants and rebates and a lot of other different forms of financial assistance. And we work a little bit in the grants and rebates section as well, and we can talk about that later if that's something you're interested in. But high level, that's what we're here for. Super high level on the 2 incentives we're talking about. 179D is the energy efficient commercial building property deduction. It's a very long name, so we just say 179D. That is worth up to $5 per square foot. And if you have heard of 179D, if you haven't done it in the past, there's a chance you heard about it because of that $5 square foot. It used to be worth up to $1.88 per square foot. Then the Inflation Reduction Act comes along in 2023 and says now it's worth up to $5 a square foot. That generates a lot more interest in this tax deduction at that point. So a 100,000 square foot building would have been worth $188,000 tax deduction for you in 2022. That's now worth $500,000 potentially in 2023. So almost a 2.5 times increase. So that got a lot of people's attention. So the Inflation Reduction Act was really jet fuel to what was an already good incentive. 45L, similar story. It was worth $2,000 per unit in 2022. Starting in 2023, it went all the way up to potentially $5,000 per unit. Now, obviously, as you can imagine, there are some strings attached to being able to reach these additional savings thresholds. But it is important to note that a lot of the time we're finding with our clients, it's very much worth it to kind of jump through a few additional hoops, because $500,000 tax deduction, millions of dollars in tax credits for 45L, incredibly valuable, especially with the way kind of commercial real estate is running now. Every dollar is exceptionally valuable to our clients right now. So that's the 50,000 foot view. So 179D, to dive into a little bit more detail, it is for commercial building owners and designers. That is the key. So when it was initially enacted, it was just for commercial building owners. And then it was expanded in 2008 to include designers of government buildings. Then it was expanded through the Inflation Reduction Act to include designers of nonprofit entities, or tax-exempt entities. So what does that mean? At a high level, it's fairly simple. The way 179D works, the mechanism, same as 45L, same as cost segregation. They are accelerated tax depreciations. So you reduce your basis in your building, basically fronting money today, and then taking it out of your depreciation schedules over 39 years or 27 and a half years. So money today basically is what it is versus money tomorrow. But you reduce your building basis. If you are a designer, you're built a school, for instance, the government can't take a tax break. They can award that tax deduction to the designer, say the architect or engineer. That architect or engineer is able to get that tax deduction. They don't have basis in the building, so they don't need to reduce basis on anything. So as you can imagine, extremely valuable incentive to these designers. So if any of your clients are architects and engineers and they're working on things, public works, or they're working for nonprofits, should really be looking at 179D. It is a very powerful incentive in that space. And then, as I already mentioned before, but I want to put it on a slide in case nobody remembered, but starting 2022 and before, it was worth up to $1.88 per square foot. Since 2006, it's actually been worth $1.80 per square foot. It inflation adjusted in 2021 to $1.82 per square foot, and then adjusted again in 2022 to be worth $1.88 per square foot. So a couple of things there. It's one of the few times where inflation is actually probably good for you. So we see that with the $5 per square foot, it's actually increased all the way up to $5.65 per square foot for buildings placed in service in 2024. So inflation is actually our friend a little bit on this incentive right now. But as I mentioned before, the big story, 2023 moving forward, it's up to $5 per square foot. So what do you need to do to meet it? We're talking about energy efficiency incentives. It's going to be a similar story for 45L in a minute here, but you have to reduce the total annual energy and power costs for either the interior lighting, so it doesn't count parking lot lighting, things like that, or it doesn't count lighting along the exterior of the building. You have to reduce the cost of the building envelope. So think if you're installing insulation, you're changing out doors, anything like that. That's going to be qualify you for the building envelope. And then the big ticket item is HVAC. So HVAC and hot water as well. And we're comparing that to a reference building that meets the minimum standards of ASHRAE 90.1. And what that really means is it has to be a demonstrated reduction in total energy and power use compared to what we call baseline energy model. So basically you take the building that exists, you put it into Department of Energy approved software, and the percentage energy cost between them is what qualifies it. So sounds simple on paper, a lot more complicated to do, but the thing you're looking for with your clients is they build a new building, or if they renovated a building, do they change out to LEDs? Did they put in new insulation? Did they replace the HVAC system? These are things that qualify them for this tax deduction. All right. And I'll keep going so we can kind of talk about buildings to give you a better idea specifically what we're talking about. So eligible buildings, commercial buildings for 179D, that is the key. So if you think about warehouses, office buildings, any of these tax exempt buildings, hotels, hospitals, as Taylor mentioned, military bases are good examples. This chart is roughly in order of complexity, just as a frame of reference for everybody. A warehouse, big open space. It's easy to do an energy model in a warehouse. If you send me to go inspect a military base, like Taylor mentioned, and they're piloting drones there, understandably, they don't let me walk around taking pictures and taking notes. So it gets a little more complicated when you start dealing with prisons and hospitals and military bases. But obviously, it can still be done. If your clients are working on those, we certainly want to look at it. But a lot of people really kind of work in the top 3 or 4 categories. So if you get clients who have any type of these buildings, either they own them or they're designing them, it's definitely worth looking into. Okay, so I guess I'll repeat myself again. Basically what I said, so if they own the building, if they're a commercial building owner, they're a great candidate for this. Any of your clients who own buildings, especially like if you got a client who has a warehouse and they make shoes or something, then that's definitely going to be a great client. Warehouses tend to be fairly large. And then designers of government buildings and not-for-profit. And the way that works is it is allocated through them through an allocation process, which that in itself, the allocation process is fairly complicated. So I would encourage you to ask some questions on there and work with people who are experts in that, because the way an allocation works for 179D is your client is the engineer. They helped design energy efficient features on a school. You have to go to the school board and request that tax deduction gets allocated to your client. As you can imagine, there's 1,000 peripheral questions with that type of conversation. So you want to make sure you're working with someone who has had that conversation a lot in the past, because you're talking to your client's clients. It is very, very important to handle that conversation correctly and with mutual respect. So definitely, if you've got any clients who are doing design work, please take this into consideration. It's very important to get that right. And I already went a little bit through the history here, but I'm going to go through it again. Just also, it's a slide deck, so you can come back and look at it later. But what this slide really shows you is that we've significantly doubled down on 179D over the years. It is a very popular incentive. As I mentioned at the start, it's not fairly well advertised, but it is popular amongst the people who are aware of it. So it came about in 2006 as of January 1 to incentivize commercial building owners. And then in 2008, Congress realized not enough people were using it. So they said, hey, there's a lot of buildings that are owned by the government. Let's extend it to these architects, engineers, energy services providers who are doing really valuable work for government buildings. But you have to go through an allocation process. So that went on for a few years like that. Every few years, 179D was extended retroactively. It would expire every few years, which on a side note, made my life very interesting for a while. Every couple of years, I thought I was going to lose my job, but they kept extending it, so I'm still here. But fortunately, 2020 was a good year for the tax code, at least for 179D. It was made permanent part of the tax code. So if you're CPAs out there and you're thinking, I've never heard of 179D, that right there is probably the reason why. There was no reason for you to consider it for tax planning purposes for a lot of your clients, because you never knew if it was going to exist in a few years. So now that it's been made permanent in 2020, it's something you can plan with your clients to know, okay, you're going to build this building, you've got this potential tax deduction available. Let's look at what that looks like. Another really strong incentive for why you should be talking to your clients about it is in 2023, the Inflation Reduction Act obviously increased that number. So a building that was relatively small, say 30,000 to 50,000 square feet, may not have been a great candidate for 179D before, because it's a tax deduction and the value has to be high enough to justify the study. All of a sudden, when the building's worth 2.5 times more as a tax deduction, it makes a lot more sense. So for a lot of your clients, if you hadn't brought this up in the past, it's definitely worth talking about it now. So high level, the history on this one is actually important because it does show that it's consistently become more valuable over time.
I think on that note, it might be a good time for our next polling question on 179D.
Yes. Thank you, Taylor. Great idea.
Absolutely.
Fun.
All right, you can see here, have your clients leveraged 179D? A, yes, B, no, C, I'm not sure, D, many times, and E's other. I think we should throw in another poll question of who wore the button-up blue striped shirt better, Mark. We'll do that at the end.
I don't think I'm going to win that one. This question I'm really curious about to see how many people have clients who've used it because, like I said, it's the IRS isn't in the habit of telling you there are tax deductions on the table generally. So.
I think there's a lot of good pairings too, as we typically have a conversation with. So if your clients are building passive house, low income housing tax and credits, historical tax credits, there's a lot to be there. And one thing I just want to point out, if there's any questions or comments you want to put in the chat, specifically put it in the Q&A section, and we will revise those and can always connect after. A lot of questions when it comes to reallocation and how to support your clients in the process there. But it looks like we have a lot of no's, a few yeses, and then some I'm not sure. So can definitely further those conversations.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, and that's about what we would expect for a lot of them. So glad to see that we're kind of consistent there. So to Taylor's point, let's switch gears here a little bit and let's talk about, she mentioned LIHTC. That's probably a hot button ticket for some of you. And I'll talk about that in a second. But 45L is 179D's cousin, if you want to call it that. So where 179D works on commercial buildings, 45L is an energy efficient credit for energy efficient homes. It's also been around since 2006. We'll go through the history a little bit. It, again, consistently becomes more valuable over time. 45L is a little different in that it isn't quite as, there aren't as many notices and clarifications on it. There are no court cases on 45L yet. So it's a little less well-known, a little bit of a less known entity than 179D. So hopefully everybody learns a little bit here today, but it is open for builders, contractors, and developers to design energy efficient homes. So think about residential. The real bread and butter of 45L is actually your multifamily housing or your large single family home developments. Those are really great candidates. Got any clients who are working on that, definitely pay attention for the next 10 minutes or so, and hopefully it's valuable for you. But as I mentioned in the intro, before 2022, it was worth $2,000 per unit. Starting in 2023, it moved up to $5,000 per unit. And we'll talk more about how it moved, but it moved up to $5,000 per unit if you meet zero energy ready homes, and it's $2,500 per unit if you meet Energy Star. That's been the main change from a technical basis. It's moved from doing a HERS rating over to an Energy Star or a ZERH rating starting in 2023. So a couple requirements. Won't go through this in huge detail. Obviously, it has to be in the US. As much as I would love to do the inspections in a different country, we're kind of stuck here. Has to be sold or leased in the relevant tax year. What does that mean? It means with your clients, you want to look at the rent rolls. It actually has to be occupied. So a good example that I use comes up during COVID. So you build a multifamily apartment building in 2020, you can't rent it out because no one's allowed to go see the apartment. So only half of it rents out in 2020. Part of it rents out in 2021. Even though the building was completed in 2020, you would take a credit per unit that was occupied in 2020, and then for the remainder that were occupied in 2021, it goes on the 21 tax return. So it is important to note that when you're talking to your clients about it, one of the key terms to use is, can you give me the rent roll? I want to know when this was first occupied. It's not just based on when it was built. So before 2023, there's an interesting distinction here. 45L pre-2023 had a height restriction on it. And that is because of the way ASHRAE 90.1 was worded. If a building is more than 3 stories, it was automatically qualified as a commercial building, which means it went into 179D. So a 4, 5, 6-story multifamily was called a 179D. It was called a commercial building. So that was a tough conversation to have with some of our clients to say, hey, you thought you were going to get a tax credit. Actually, it's going to be a tax deduction instead. So it made a bit of a difference for us. The interesting thing is Inflation Reduction Act eliminated that height restriction. And offline, we can talk into the details of how it did that, but basically it involves switching energy codes. But the way it did that is we had to use ResNet before. January 1st, 2023. Now we use Zero Energy Ready Home program or Energy Star. Now, hopefully most of you are at least somewhat familiar with Energy Star because you've got an Energy Star refrigerator or windows or whatever it might be. There is an entire Energy Star contracting agreement where you basically have to build to a lot of different requirements. The consulting on that is a service line that Leighton offers. Not a lot of people who do that. So if you've got a client who is getting close to being Energy Star compliant, we can help get you over the hump, or at least help you do the analysis to figure out whether or not it makes sense to do so. And surprisingly, depending on what municipalities you're building in, we do often find that some areas are so close to building to Energy Star standards that even if they don't say it, the cost difference to your client just to do that small upgrade to Energy Star might make the difference of you getting, millions of dollars of tax deductions on some of these buildings. So just something to be aware in the back of your head is when I say Energy Star, a lot of people right off the bat say, we don't do that. You're wasting my time. You might be pretty close. So we already kind of mentioned eligible buildings before: single and multifamily apartment buildings, townhouses are great ones, student housing, assisted living. These are all types of things you want to look at, but obviously, as I mentioned before, large single family home developments and multifamily homes, those are going to be the bread and butter of 45L. So I want to put this slide on here because the key is when a lot of people say, okay, it's developers, contractors, and investors are the ones who are eligible. What you're really looking for, and most of you are CPAs in here, you have to have basis in the building during construction. That's kind of the litmus test you want to look at. So if somebody is just, say, the developer of the building, but they don't have any basis, all they do is basically help manage the construction of it. They don't actually own that building. It has to be whoever had basis in it. That's the path to follow through to determine if they're eligible. And as I promised before, a little bit of boring history on 45L. So it has been around since 2006, introduced in 2005. It did actually expire in 2021, but the Inflation Reduction Act retroactively reactivated it and extended it to 2032. So a few less bumps along the road for 45L, but it is not permanent. However, it's good until 2032, which I think most of us will agree is pretty close to permanent for right now. That does allow you as CPAs with your clients to plan on this. If you've got a client who's building a large multifamily building, or they've got a bunch of single family homes going in that they have some ownership in, definitely want to start looking into this. And for similar reason, 45L, it was periodically extended as well. If you haven't heard of it, it's likely for the same reason as 179D, is it kind of disappeared. And I mean, they flat out let it expire in 2021. So it was actually gone for a little while. So from a tax planning purpose, it was a little riskier before, but now you've got some assurances it'll be around for a little while. So the big thing, Inflation Reduction Act. So high level overview, what was the Inflation Reduction Act? And actually, before I do that, I just realized we have a 45L polling question. So I can see Taylor.
I was just about to say the mute button did not want to get off, but yes, next polling question. Have your clients leveraged 45L? A yes, B no, C I'm not sure, D many times, E other.
Sorry, I was a little excited to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act.
You were. It got me excited. I did see a comment that they thought our shirts were uniform, which I think was hysterical. So I think we're going to have one day where we all wear the same exact top. We see a lot of no's here. So it's good that we're going over this. And again, can follow up with any specific questions. I see a lot of good ones in the Q&A.
Right. Okay, I mean, basically, just looking at the responses, so it's about what I expected, where not as many people are participating in 45L. It's even less so advertised in other incentives. 45L is a very interesting space where there's a huge amount of growth. As you can imagine, commercial real estate is in a tough position right now with a lot of people working from home, but the counter to that is there's a fair bit of multifamily housing going up. And a lot of these clients just do not know about an incentive like 45L. So this poll kind of tells me what I would have expected, that we need to be advertising this a little better. Okay, well, I think I am clear to go ahead here. Inflation Reduction Act, so high level, as I mentioned. Probably everyone remembers that was a pretty big deal back in 2022, and that got signed in August. The intent behind it is really to reduce carbon emissions. There's a lot of healthcare pieces in there, help support the IRS, and really taxpayer compliance. It was allocated $400 billion in clean energy incentives, which is part of why this is now worth $5 per square foot and $5,000 per unit when it wasn't before. So there was a fair bit of money earmarked to really drive the behaviors here. So what really happened for 179D? We've kind of gone through some high-level change. The big ticket item, obviously, is everybody knows it went from $1.80 or $1.88 after inflation adjustment, all the way up to $5 a square foot. That's the big ticket item that gets people's attention. The other big ticket item that people tend to pay attention to on 179D is eligibility was increased. So now nonprofits can allocate the tax deduction to the designer. And just imagine what a big deal that is. Think about how many churches there are in the entire United States. They can all allocate tax deductions now. Any nonprofits, Boys and Girls Club of America, all these other things, they can start allocating these tax deductions now to the designers. So we've had clients in the past who never would have participated in 179D because they really only did nonprofit work. Now all of a sudden there's an influx of them. So the interesting thing with nonprofits really is they're a little more inclined to ask, how can we share in the benefit of a 179D tax deduction? That is a fairly complicated discussion. I would, if you get into that, please loop us in on something like that, because it does involve a fair bit of detail along, as I mentioned, the complexity of allocation before. So it's coming up a lot more often. We're seeing a lot more information on that. Tribal councils, were involved with a few of them as well. So there's definitely a lot of complexities involved with allocation for nonprofits. The other thing that's really interesting is real estate investment trusts are now eligible to take 179D tax deductions. So it's become much more attractive to REITs. The biggest challenge and the biggest counter with REITs is they tend to have so many shareholders that they don't often see the value of it because of dilution of value. So if you do happen to be working with a REIT, it's definitely worth considering. What we've seen, though, is you tend to really need fairly large buildings or a fairly simple REIT structure in order to be able to benefit from it. A couple items you may not know about the changes. So there was a lifetime cap on the deduction. So 179D was worth up to $1.80 per square foot once for the lifetime building. So if it's a 100,000 square foot building, it's $180,000 tax deduction. That's it, never again. It has been changed through the Inflation Reduction Act. So basically, at a simplistic level, every 4th year, if you're doing improvements for the building, you can claim the deduction again. So the reason why they did that is pretty simple. Government recognized that people do renovations. It's amazing how many times I would go to a school and find out the deduction had been claimed forever. But schools renovate constantly, and they could just never participate in the incentive again. So they removed that, which was very nice to see that people were thinking forward on that one. The one we're going to talk about in more detail is prevailing wage and apprenticeship have been added to a lot of different parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. And we'll talk through that in a lot more detail later, and imagine that's why a lot of you are here. But at a high level, prevailing wages, you have to pay a local prevailing wage for that job. So if in the county you're in, the prevailing wage for an electrician, and there's a website you can go look it up, is $17.13, and you're paying $17 even, you're not paying prevailing wage for electricians on that job. It's at a high level, that's basically what it is. They're also trying to incentivize apprentices. So using registered apprenticeship programs to really help bolster the whole trades sector within the economy. So it's a great thing to have in there, but I think they were aware that the apprenticeship was going to be a bit of an issue because there's an exemption if there are no apprenticeship programs in your area. And we'll talk about that a little more. The other one, we talked earlier about the energy standard we used for 179D being ASHRAE 90.1. The standard has actually been affirmed to use ASHRAE 90.1 from 2007. So that means when you build an energy model to see, is this building more efficient than a standard building, we are comparing to a standard building from 2007. So you can imagine a modern construction building is going to follow much more strict building codes now. You're going to do very well by default against a 2007 standard building. So that's great news. Why would they do that? It seems like a bit of an unfair advantage. It's because the incentive is intended to be used. it's still, I mean, we saw from the polling questions, a lot of people still don't know about it. So really, Congress wanted to make this incentive able to be used by affirming the standard that actually allows you to be in a good shop. I've got a lot of clients come to me and say, I never improve the efficiency of a building by 25%. Yeah, maybe if you're looking at straight up utility bills, you're probably not going to make a 25% change. But if you look at your building compared to an ASHRAE baseline building for 2007, pretty good chance you've made more than a 25% difference when you made the changes you made. So just something to be aware in the back of your head of kind of a common objection that we see. So apprenticeship. This is one I wanted to have a chat with everyone about. Basically, the way it works is you have to look at the total labor hours that are going into an apprentice program. And the way it works is for any project from started before January 1st, 2023, 10% of the labor hours actually have to come from someone who's with a registered apprenticeship program. And then that goes up from there all the way up to 15% for projects after, starting January earlier this year. So the ramp up is fairly quick, as you've seen. So what you have to be able to do is obviously you have to be able to track that. And it all has to be through a apprenticeship program. So what you need to do is you actually need to go and check to see, okay, do we have apprentices on this job? Or are we planning on it? If we aren't, we have to go and find the Department of Labor or state apprenticeship agency, if you have one, and request apprentices. If you do not have either of those in your area, you can actually be exempted from the requirement. So a really, really remote project may not require apprentices. We don't know exactly how often that's happening, but basically you have to write and you have to follow up frequently to make sure. This isn't a once and done thing. You got to make sure you're actually continuously checking, hey, can I get apprentices? The other key thing here is you have to have a ratio of apprentices to journey workers. The reason for that is you have to have supervision, training, and safety. You can't just have a whole ton of apprentices running around without somebody paying attention to them. So at the end of the day, that's really kind of the meat and potatoes of this. There is some clarifications that are pending on what this will look like. And there's been a question period on some additional clarifications on how we actually meet these things. We're still waiting for additional clarification on it, but at a high level, this is really what's going on. What we have seen in the space is a lot of our clients, they may be doing this if they have government projects, for instance. If you're working on government projects, you may be required to do this already. So there's also some projects, if they involve like HUD funding and things like that, there's certain additional requirements that you need to meet. So it's definitely worth checking in to see, okay, where's the funding from this project coming from? And does that funding require us to have already met these requirements for apprenticeship programs? So honestly, we need more clarification, but you could probably do a whole webinar just on prevailing wage and apprenticeship. And in fact, we did do a whole webinar on it a few weeks ago, but we don't have time to go through all of that now. I just want to give everybody the highlights. So prevailing wage, this is the other one. This one's a little more nuanced. So basically the idea is it more or less follows Davis-Bacon wages. The big thing to bear in mind is that the Inflation Reduction Act and 179D are part of the tax code. The Davis-Bacon is actually part of the Department of Labor. So there's a bit of a conflict there. So you got to make sure that you're actually meeting all of these prevailing wages. And you do that through the Systems for Reward Management government.gov website. It's got basically a searchable database where, as I mentioned before, you can go figure out, okay, in my county, how much should I pay an electrician? Now, I think all of you are probably doing the math in your head pretty quickly and figuring out, okay, this applies to all laborers, mechanics. That means all contractors. It actually means all subcontractors. It means anybody who's on the job. You've got to be able to prove every single person meets those requirements. So the burden of proof on this is pretty high. And what that means is, as I mentioned before, when the government went through a question period, there were a lot of questions because that is a pretty high burden of proof. The current law as it's written, you basically have to provide that information with the tax return. So it is not a trust and verify, it is a verify from step one. So the act of actually proving all of this at once is quite complicated, and then going through payroll records for all the subcontractors. So it's incredibly complex as it is written. And as I mentioned before, we're still looking for a little more legislation, but the key to look at with this, like I mentioned before, the apprenticeship, is you look at a lot of times the funding source. So as I mentioned before, HUD loans may require, or likely to require you to do this, pay local prevailing wage. A lot of government jobs just flat out require you to pay local prevailing wage. So it is worth talking to clients and business owners about that. The general trend we've seen is if you're building an apartment building in Arkansas, a pretty good chance you're not going to be paying prevailing wage because you're trying to put up the building in the most cost-effective possible way. But if you're building inside, say, New York City, you may not have a choice. You may have to be building prevailing wage anyway, depending on what your funding sources are. So there's a few nuances here for everyone to look at, but definitely something to keep in mind as you're moving forward with your clients. So 45L. And the one thing I did want to point out here is, so you see 179D, it requires prevailing wage and apprenticeship. 45L only requires prevailing wage. There's no apprenticeship requirement on 45L, which is nice there. So multifamily buildings do not have to worry about apprenticeship or single family homes. The big change, as I mentioned, through the Inflation Reduction Act, 45L went from $2,000 a unit all the way up to $5,000. We talked before, we moved from using ResNet rating to Energy Star or Zero Energy Ready Home. I also mentioned some of the concerns about a lot of people are just saying, hey, I don't do Energy Star. You'd be surprised how close you are. That 3-story height was removed. And as Taylor mentioned on the intro right off the bat when we started talking about 45L, LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits, they were not compatible with 45L very well in the past because LIHTC does not like it when you reduce your basis. It makes it much less valuable. Whereas now, taking 45L does not reduce your LIHTC basis starting in 2023. So if you get any clients who are using LIHTC to fund their projects, 45L is now attractive to them. And I already mentioned, we've only got prevailing wage, no apprenticeship. So that is a lot of information to go through there. I realize that. Honestly, this is the bulk of the presentation we're going to keep going through. I know a lot of the questions are going to come from there, but I'm thinking at this point it probably makes sense to pause for another polling question.
Absolutely. We have a decent amount of questions popping up as well. So again, happy to connect with those afterwards to get you answers. A lot has to do with paid prevailing wages, apprenticeship programs. Do they need to be union members or just paid prevailing wages? So a lot of good questions. But for this polling question, additional questions you have for us, book a meeting, have any more, please put them in the Q&A and happy to connect as well.
Yeah, so I think what I'll do is, given the number of questions here, I'm going to go through the next couple slides here a little quicker and then try to pick out some questions here pretty quickly. Because a lot of this is really examples and kind of the process. So I can click through this pretty quickly and then kind of pick through some questions. But the basic process is the same for 179D and 45L. You collect documents. You're required to create a Department of Energy approved energy model. You have to do a site inspection. For 179D, it's by a licensed professional engineer. Then that licensed professional engineer certifies your property. A lot of CPAs here, so basically the way you file it, it used to be 179D was just taken as an other deduction. It is now taken under Form 7205. There's a couple versions of Form 7205 based on the inflation amounts, but it's a fairly simple form. It allows for a little easier audit for the IRS at this point. If they're able to look at it, they can pretty clearly see that, yes, you did actually depreciate the basis on the correct building. If you're not doing it on a current tax return, you'll file a 3115. You do your automatic accounting method change. You can go back all the way to 2006. Realistically, you probably only want to go back 5 to 7 years. Beyond that, you've got to worry about depreciation recapture. If your client is a designer, so an architect, engineer, energy services company, you have to, it's a 3-year look back on an amended tax return. That's how they can take theirs. So designers, it's really important to try to claim it on a current return as much as possible. So high level, pretty simple. I'm sure most of you get that as well. I'm not going to go through this, but we left it in the slide deck to give you an idea of the value. You can see the value pretty significantly changes, and there's a lot of numbers in this table. But the highlight really is we're trying to hit 50% energy savings. That's where you get that $1.80 to $1.88 per square foot. If your building is 50% more efficient than an ASHRAE 90.1, and I'm going to answer this question right now because I saw it. ASHRAE is the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. They create an energy standard that says, here's how you build a building according to our standards. So Karen, I got your question right back. So this table basically tells you what it's worth based on what savings thresholds percentages you hit. And then it all kind of gets thrown for a loop with the Inflation Reduction Act starting in 2023. And it just moves to a straight linear percentage scale. So at 25%, you get this much, 50 cents. If you're meeting prevailing wage and apprenticeship, you get $2.50. And it just scales pretty much linearly up to $5 a square foot. So what that really means is you had kickoff points before 2023, where it was very important to hit 10% or 15% or 25%. Now it's less important because it just scales linearly. So I already mentioned 45L, same process. The difference is 45L uses this form 8908, and it's got a 3-year look back. So 45L is a credit. You can't go back and file a 3115 and take it for however long you want. You got to do it within the past 3 years. So there's a statute of limitations. Basically, if your client has finished buildings in 2020 or 2021, you want to be on this pretty quickly. So it's running to the point where you may not be able to claim it anymore, and if you lose it, it's gone. So I already kind of mentioned this, but Energy Star is worth $2,500 per unit starting in 2023. Zero Energy Ready Homes, which not a lot of people are doing, is worth up to $5,000 per unit. Single family homes do not have to do prevailing wage. So another big benefit here is single family home is worth $5,000 or $2,500, whether you're meeting prevailing wage or not. And you can kind of see this from the table. Those numbers don't change. These numbers do change. If you meet Energy Star, but you're not doing prevailing wage, it drops down to $500 per unit. If you're doing Energy Star and prevailing wage, $2,500 per unit. One key thing I did not mention here earlier, and I'm going to stop and talk about it right now. There is an exemption period specifically for 179D, and I'm kicking myself for not mentioning it before, but basically the Congress is smart when they put this in place, and they said, we will give you a certain amount of time to be compliant. We're going to change the rules here and say you have to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship, but we're going to recognize that we changed the rules and didn't tell you. So you've got 60 days to comply before you start construction. And they gave us that notice on November 29th, 2022. So that means any project that started before 60 days from now, which is January 29th, 2023, any project that started before that is grandfathered in and does not need to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship. So that's pretty key. It's very important for you to understand that if your client started a project in 2022 and they finished it in 2024, you probably don't have to worry about prevailing wage and apprenticeship. It means you're eligible for up to $5,000 or $5 per square foot without jumping through those additional hoops of having to prove prevailing wage and apprenticeship. So when you're looking at this, if you're looking at that $5 a square foot, please consider when construction started. If it was before January 29th, 2023, you're in a pretty good position. If it's after, we're going to have to answer some more questions. Now, there's a lot of details on what it means for when construction started, but you can reach out to us for more details on that. But keep in mind the grandfather clause only works for 179D. So the lobby for 45L, not quite as strong. There is no exemption there. So if you didn't have a crystal ball and on January or December 31st, 2022, you were not building to Energy Star and you placed your building in service in 2023, it's too bad. You had to be building to Energy Star standards, unfortunately. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, along the line of Energy Star, we are actually an official Energy Star partner. It is required on all 45L studies post-Inflation Reduction Act. The reason why you would want to do it, if any of your clients are doing it, there's a lot of benefits to Energy Star, but basically Energy Star buildings are sold or rented approximately 6% higher than market value. So it is fairly valuable to your client. And that goes back to, we can help you do the analysis. If you're getting close to Energy Star, we can potentially help you overcome that hump to say, okay, you're going to get 6% more market value on this. here's the additional costs of doing Energy Star. We can help you quantify that a little bit to help your client make that decision. Now, I'm going to go through cost seg real quick because most of your CPAs, but we also do cost segregation. The reason why we do all three of those in-house, we have an in-house CPA. So we're able to kind of speak the same language and help work through that. Cost seg pairs extremely well with 179D and 45L. So if you think of cost segregation as a cake that's going to accelerate a whole lot of depreciation, 179D and 45L pick off where it ends. So they're a little bit of icing on top of the cake because 179D and 45L will allow you to accelerate depreciation on things that you could not touch with a cost segregation study. So if your clients are doing cost seg, they probably should be doing 179D and 45L. That's pretty much the litmus. If they're not doing cost seg or you're not doing cost seg for them, there's probably a good reason. It's probably a tax position reason, and it may kibosh a 179D or a 45L deal as well. So the litmus test on whether or not you should do 179D and 45L, a lot of it's going to come down to if they're in a tax position to do cost seg. So I'm not going to go through a lot of detail on that because most of you are going to be pretty familiar. And I think what I'll do is, you've got the slide deck so you can kind of see the examples, but most of you are smart enough here to do the math pretty quick on square footage times dollar or number of units times $2,000. So you've got the slides here if you need them. What I was thinking I was going to do is pop through for the next 9 minutes and just kind of kick through some questions here. So I don't know, I'm going to look through and see what we've got right off the bat here. I did see one question right off the bat for if you do only a small amount of renovation, and this comes up pretty often. So a client goes in and installs $5,000 of LED lighting in a large warehouse. Can you go claim all of this amount? Like, can you go claim, let's say it's a 500,000 square foot warehouse times $5 square foot. Can you go claim a $2.5 million tax deduction on installing $10,000 of LED lights? No, you can't. So you are limited by the cost of putting the equipment into place. So where this comes up is a lot of renovation projects where you replace one rooftop unit and we go to claim the whole building. You can't do that. You're limited by the cost of whatever improvements you did.
There's a good one.
Go ahead, Taylor.
I was going to say, Mark, one I get quite often, and I did see here the difference between 179D lowercase d and 179D uppercase d. I think there's sometimes a lot of confusion with those two.
Yeah. So 179D capital D, the one that we work on, is really the commercial building one. 179 small d is a lot more for smaller things, basically like appreciating farm equipment and things like that. So 179D capital D is the big one for large commercial buildings. So it is important. The capitalization of this is pretty important, but if you do a Google search, you'll see quite a combo of everything. So this does apply to existing buildings. So upgrades on existing buildings are kind of the bread and butter of this. There's two ways they're trying to incentivize, both for 45L and 179D. It's new construction and renovations. So cost segregation also works on renovations as well. So all of them are designed around, did you make that much difference? The big factor on renovations is, did you renovate enough? Now, there's a lot of technical criteria that go into that, especially for something like 45L, where you have to have X amount of impact on the building envelope. You can't just renovate, say, the HVAC on a multifamily building. You actually have to touch the exterior pre-2023. Post-2023 is different because of Energy Star. But for 179D, renovations are great. Where renovations are not great is if you went in and put in new lights in a building and you've got a boiler from the 1950s in there. I still have to put that 1950s boiler into my energy model. So it is important to note that what you upgrade matters. Isaac asked, what's the best way to test for qualification? The one I always start with is, do you do cost seg? It's the quickest and easiest way to figure it out. If someone does cost seg, they're in a tax position to take 179D and 45L. The technical perspective on 179D is generally you need a building to be more than 50,000 square feet. Otherwise, the net benefit to a client is not very high. For 45L, generally around 20 units tends to be where you want to look at. And they have to have made improvements to energy efficiency, so lighting, building envelope, or HVAC. It's everywhere. Yeah, all no, not U.S. territories. It's continental U.S. for both of these, in case anyone's in Alaska, Hawaii, lower 48. That's where you got to go for these. Keegan was asking the upcoming event. It's actually an old event, and if you go into YouTube and just search for Layton, you can actually find the event we just did on prevailing wage and apprenticeship if you're looking for that. I don't know if we can drop that in the chat here, but you can go find it if you're looking for it. Go to our website or go to YouTube and you can find the longer session we did on prevailing wage. Richard was asking you about IRS audits, which is a good question. So we offer audit support at Layton because we've done 10,000 studies, so we're very familiar with how to do these. Audits are probably going up. The IRS has said there is particularly going to be start auditing large businesses a lot more often. The audit rate used to be 2%, give or take. It's very likely to go up. The IRS has actually been hiring engineers specifically to be able to audit this because it's a very complicated technical thing that we're putting in front of the IRS. So IRS audits going up. The key is if you're working with anyone who does 179D, the IRS has a practice unit that explains what they are going to ask you during an audit. So you want to work with a provider who builds their service line around the IRS practice unit. And you can go find that online pretty easily to see what the questions are going to be. But generally speaking, we know what they're going to ask before they ask. They're fairly simple questions, like people were depreciating the wrong buildings, like the address would be wrong, or they had the wrong tax basis on there. There's a lot of things like that that are now included in the practice unit to let you know. There's a lot of stuff in the practice unit on allocation. It goes back to what I was saying before. Do not get allocation wrong, because allocation, if you want to look at it, is almost free money for these architects and engineers. So you can imagine people pay a lot of attention to that.
Got a good question from Matt for, can you claim both 179D and 45L on the same project?
You can actually. So you could not before 2023. Your building was either a commercial building or it was a residential building. 2023 removed the height restriction. So if you have a multifamily building and it's 5 stories, it is actually both a multifamily building and a commercial building at that point. So there's an interesting double dip here, which really coincides with cost segregation. One of the reasons why we offer all 3 is because all of these go onto your depreciation schedules. So you couple that with the cost segregation to make sure you're not depreciating the wrong thing. But you can do all of them. It's perfectly legal. You just got to make sure you're depreciating the right things. I had someone ask, is it for homeowners? No, it's commercial buildings and developers. Sorry, you can't do it on your own house. Long-term leases, can they qualify? It depends on who paid for the improvements. So a good example would be like Google. Google buys not really don't buy, they rent a shell, but they do everything inside the building. They put in all the walls, they put in all the HVAC, they put in all the lighting, they own it. So Google is able to put that on their depreciation schedules. They can take 179D in that case. But if someone gave that building to Google as part of tenant improvements that they gave them a TI allowance, that's where it gets a lot more complicated, because you basically have to track the money. I'm just kind of floating through here. There are a lot of questions. Joseph was asking, and this is a common question, so great question, Joseph. This is you're comparing to a reduction in energy costs. So if it's a new construction, how do you have a reduction in energy costs? You don't. So we're not actually comparing apples and apples. It's not a before and after analysis we're doing here. It is what is your building as it is today to this government standard building from 2007. So it doesn't necessarily matter if it's a new construction or a renovation. Interim lighting is a good one. Kyle asked about interim lighting. It does work for parking garages, but that was eliminated in the Inflation Reduction Act. So old buildings, interim lighting is okay. It's not worth as much, but parking garages are a prime candidate for the carve out of lighting called interim lighting. Okay, now I don't know if we're allowed to keep going and answering questions, or we should probably cut it off here.
I would say if you have one quick question, that would be the end, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up the webinar. So one quick one, please.
One quick one. All right, let me find a good one. All right, I'm into the hellos here. Let me go back up to the top.
I see, does this apply to all existing buildings? And then a lot of California energy requirements, and if that.
Yep, no, this applies for pretty much all buildings. So it all applies to the building. Yeah, I see a question in there, but does it apply to the equipment inside? No, just to the building itself. So we reduce the basis of the building itself. Okay, well, I know we are at time here. There is a lot of questions. We can try to follow up on these later. You've got a link to schedule a meeting with us as well. And Taylor, I don't know if you had anything to close us out.
Yeah, I was going to say we will try to get back to y'all as soon as possible to dive into your questions more. Feel free to book some time with us or reach out for further questions. And again, keep us posted if you're going to be at Engage this year in June in Las Vegas. But thank you all so much for your time, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
All right. Wow.
Okay,
Great. That was great. Thank you so much. Really engaged questions and answer section right there. So thank you so much. I know our attendees appreciate that. And so we appreciate you coming onto our platform and giving all that great information. And, we appreciate our attendees for being here as well. So thank you. Thank you. Go ahead and jump on over to your inbox. We should have an evaluation form waiting for you there. We definitely would welcome and appreciate your feedback. That's also in your CPA Academy accounts. You'll also find your issued credit there as well. Seeing some nice comments coming through. That's wonderful. So thank you all so much for that. And please check out our schedule on cpaacademy.org because I hope to see you all on future webinars. But for now, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all next time. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Vaughn.